Have you ever looked at a map of Europe's language families and thought, wait a minute, why is there this big leap between Italy and Romania in the Romance languages? Like, you've got Portuguese and Spanish on the Iberian Peninsula, French and Italian holding it down a little to the east, and then boom, way over on the other side of the Balkans, there's Romania, speaking a Latin-based language while being surrounded by Slavic language countries. We all know why Romanian is a Romance language. It has to do precisely with the invasion and occupation of the Roman Empire, which destroyed the local Dacian culture and replaced it with their own. But the Romans also controlled most of the Balkans, which are now Slavic, so what happened to everything in between? Why is there this big Romance no man's land from Slovenia to Serbia to Bulgaria? Well, as it turns out, that region wasn't always a linguistic void for these descendants of Latin. There used to be languages that acted as a sort of bridge, namely Dalmatian, which surprisingly was not spoken by the breed of dogs. So let's find out what this was and why it disappeared. Before we dive into these long-lost languages, let's zoom out for a second and get a grip on what Romance languages even are and how they got to where they are today. The name might sound steamy, but it has nothing to do with romantic love and everything to do with Rome. They're called Romance because they descend from Vulgar Latin, the everyday spoken language of the Roman Empire. When Rome was at its height, it wasn't just building aqueducts and arenas, it was spreading its language of Latin from Portugal to Syria. If Rome ruled it, likely it was Latin that echoed through the streets, often mixed with local languages, but it was there. Now, we've got to make an important distinction here. There is classical Latin, the fancy stuff you see in Roman literature and inscriptions, and then there's Vulgar Latin, the spoken, much messier version that regular people used when talking to each other. Think of it as the difference between Shakespearean English and modern, slangy TikTok English. Shakespeare wasn't writing stuff like Sigma, although he did also invent a bunch of new words at the time, like bedazzled, so maybe your local weird TikToker will be viewed as Shakespeare in 400 years too. Anyway, Vulgar Latin evolved differently depending on where you were in the empire, mixing with local languages, picking up regional accents, and generally being kind of chaotic. Fast forward a few centuries and voila, we get the Romance languages: Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, and Romanian, plus a couple other ones. Because after the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, Latin didn't just vanish, it held on, morphing into new forms as local kingdoms and cultures rose from its ashes. In some areas, these new languages thrived and eventually became national tongues. In other places, they faded away, overtaken by political upheaval, migration, or conquest. That is the case with Dalmatian, our unsung hero, or rather ghost, of Romance language history. Now, Dalmatian died out in about 1898, so there's no way that you can learn it today, but thankfully, you can still learn all the other Romance languages, which, and I may be biased here by being Portuguese, are the prettiest languages in the world, and the best way to learn them is through the sponsor of this video, Lingopie. Lingopie is like the Netflix of language learners. I've been using it and I like it because it doesn't make me do pointless exercises with vocabulary that I'm never going to use like some other apps. Instead, I am learning by watching. Through it, you can learn Spanish, French, or Italian, plus 10 other languages. They've recently added Greek and Polish with authentic TV shows, movies, or even podcasts of the languages you want to learn. There are over 3,000 shows and movies that they offer. What's even cooler is that I can then connect it to my Disney Plus and Netflix accounts and enjoy the content that I usually watch there, learning through it with Lingopie. And it's not just on my phone, it's also on desktop and TV. Not only do you learn by watching the shows with their double subtitles feature, but Lingopie turns every episode into a lesson through flashcards and quizzes, helping us retain what we learned. Being Portuguese, I always think that I know Spanish. I don't. I always struggle, especially with the vocabulary. And so I've been using Lingopie lately to actually learn it properly. I'm honestly surprised at how much I've learned in just a few weeks. If you've ever wanted to learn a new language, and especially if you've tried other apps before to do it and ended up giving up, you have to try Lingopie, because I really think this will be the way for you to learn. Also, if you're unsure about which language you want to learn, no problem, because when you pay for Lingopie, you get access to all the languages they offer. You can go to learn.lingopie.com/general-knowledge and get 7 days for free plus 55% off your paid subscription. And now let's get back to the video. So now that we understand a quick background context on Latin and Romance languages, let's learn about the one that disappeared. Dalmatian was spoken along the adequately named Dalmatian coast, in what's now Croatia and Montenegro, plus a little bit of Bosnia. It came from Vulgar Latin, surviving after the fall of the empire and mixing with local Illyrian and later Slavic influences. The Dalmatian coast had a bunch of independent city-states during the Middle Ages, like Ragusa, which is modern-day Dubrovnik, Zara, which is now Zadar, and Spalato, which we now call Split. Each of these cities had its own version of the Dalmatian language, though the differences weren't huge. In fact, these dialects were often mutually intelligible, maybe like Portuguese, Spanish, and Catalan are today. Dalmatian evolved in isolation but was still recognizably a Romance language, like Italy's distant, weird cousin. For centuries, it held its own, especially in maritime trade and city administration, but the linguistic tide was rising and it spoke Slavic. Starting in the 7th century, waves of Slavic migrations brought new settlers into the Balkans, and with them came Slavic languages. Croatian became the dominant cultural force, especially in inland regions, and eventually on the coast too. At the same time, parts of the Dalmatian coast fell under Venetian control, especially from the 15th century onward. And this meant that Dalmatian was being squeezed from two sides, Croatian on the landward side and Italian, or rather Venetian, from the sea. Eventually, it stopped being the language of government, trade, or even the home. Bit by bit, parents stopped passing it on to their kids. That's how languages usually die, not with a bang, but in a whisper. The final nail in the coffin came with the death of the last speaker of Dalmatian in 1898. Interestingly, Dalmatian isn't the only Romance language that disappeared, and in the old Iberian Peninsula, despite there being many Romance languages left today, and in this case not a gap in the territory, there was an old one that became extinct too, Mozarabic. If the name sounds vaguely Arabic to you, you're on the right track. Mozarabic was spoken here mostly by Christians living under Muslim rule in what is now Spain and Portugal between the 8th and 14th centuries. When Muslim armies crossed from North Africa in 711 and quickly took over most of the peninsula, they didn't immediately force everyone to speak Arabic or convert to Islam. A significant Christian population remained, and they kept using their Latin-derived dialects, which were already evolving away from classical Latin thanks to centuries of local development. These Christians under Muslim rule came to be called Mozarabs, from the Arabic term mustarab, meaning Arabized, and their language was thus called Mozarabic. While the language wasn't standardized, it survived in spoken form for centuries, and we can detect its fingerprints in a few surprising places. For example, some Arabic words that later became common in Spanish or Portuguese, like aceituna, olive, and alcazar, which in Spanish means fortress. These were likely filtered through the Mozarabic dialect before becoming fully adopted. It was essentially a dialect that mixed a local version of Latin with the newly arrived Arabic people. It also had some quirks that made it stand out. Apparently, it held on to some Latin features that Spanish would eventually lose, like often retaining full vowel endings where Spanish simplified or just dropped them. Linguists love this kind of stuff because it gives us clues about how languages evolve and how contact with other cultures, in this case Arabic, can stretch and twist a language in new directions. Now, Mozarabic wasn't one standardized language either. It was more of a group of closely related dialects, a little similar to how Dalmatian varied from city to city. It didn't have a written literary tradition the way Latin or Arabic did. Maybe that's why it died out in part, and most of what we know today about it comes from Arabic script texts. These little linguistic Easter eggs are like whispers of a lost time, hinting at a world when Latin and Arabic coexisted in the same street markets, churches, and taverns. So what happened to it? Why did Mozarabic disappear? Well, it was a mix of things. As Christian kingdoms like Portugal, Castile, and Leon pushed south in the Reconquista, Mozarabic speakers were often absorbed into the growing influence of standardizing medieval Spanish. Many Mozarabic communities fled or were relocated, and in their new homes they gradually switched to early forms of Castilian and Portuguese. Over time, Mozarabic just sort of faded away. Its speakers assimilated, unique dialects were lost, and the last solid evidence we have of it dates to around the 13th or 14th century. And by then it was on linguistic life support. So what do we make of this? Two Romance languages, Mozarabic in the west, Dalmatian in the east, that once filled in the geographic blanks but vanished under pressure from stronger languages and shifting empires. Both were relics of Latin's wide-reaching legacy, surviving for centuries after Rome's fall, only to eventually fade away into the background, and now living on mostly in academic papers. Romania's survival, especially when you think about what it was up against, is actually pretty impressive. After the fall of Roman Dacia in the 3rd century, the region was overrun repeatedly by invading powers, the Goths, Huns, Slavs, Avars, Bulgars, you name it. And despite that chaotic mix, the Latin language held on, especially in the more isolated Carpathian mountain areas. Romanian slowly evolved, absorbing some loanwords from its neighbors like Hungarian, the Slavs, and even some Turkish ones, and even a sprinkle of Greek, but yet its core remained Latin-based. It's not surprising that Dalmatian disappeared. What is surprising is that Romanian survived. When a Romanian national identity began to crystallize in the 19th century, the language was actually re-standardized, with a heavy nod back towards Latin roots, an intentional revival of sorts that reinforced its place in the Romance family, arguably to differentiate themselves from their neighbors and assert their difference and unique identity. And zooming out, the stories of Mozarabic and Dalmatian aren't unique. Languages die all the time, sometimes slowly, sometimes more violently. Often it's because of a more prestigious or useful language emerging. Sometimes there's just a standardization or national borders shift, colonization happens, or even just the allure of TV and internet content in bigger languages can quietly make local speech disappear. And when a language fades away, we lose more than just the words. We lose the idioms, the histories, the ways of thinking. Mozarabic and Dalmatian may be gone, but their stories remind us of just how fragile and valuable our linguistic diversity really is, because who knows if in 1,000 years we'll just have a single European language and we'll be watching a video called the 24 Lost Languages of Europe. So next time you look at a map and think it's weird how Romania is just there, all Latin speaking, separated from its linguistic cousins, remember there used to be a fuller story. Dalmatian was there as a connective tissue. It may be gone, but their ghostly line is still marking the historical record. And hey, at least now you've got a cool conversation started for your next family dinner. Did you know that there used to be a Romance language spoken in Croatia or one in Muslim Spain? Maybe you're gonna spark someone's linguistic curiosity, or maybe they'll just think you're weird. Either way, thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you next time for more general knowledge.